Hello, hello.
Okay, this is working.
Yeah. I was like, oh, I have to download things.
Right. Zoom. Cool. You're Ted.
Yeah, I remember you. We were hanging out in Portland at Monotorama briefly. I
Yes,
don't think
that's
I've
right.
seen you around elsewhere.
Right. Yes. You're light step.
I am. Yeah, I work with Ben.
Cool. And you proposed the standard interchange format.
I did. Yeah, I've kind of been sitting on that because there was a lot of debate over who wanted what
Uh-huh.
exactly. Um,
Yeah.
that's the thing I would like to bring back up.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. No, seems I mean, seems good, but also slightly terrifying
right.
because
Yeah.
I don't emit, JSON spans currently, and then I'd have to do so.
Yeah. Well, for
Uh,
me, the whole thing was actually a facade, a front, if you will, to attempt to get the um, the standard nailed down in a language that was a little more specific than English. Right now, the specification is very Englishy,
mhm,
and
mhm.
I am kind of interested in just being like, well, what is the information that comes out of these calls, be it JSON formatted or whatever? Is there some representation we could agree on where if someone admitted that, you could point at it and be like, that's open tracing. I could read that in and do open tracing things with that. Um, and
Right.
so I was intrigued when that conversation started, for example, what things people were like, oh, that is standardizable, and what things people were saying like, no, 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 you can't have a thing called trace context because who knows what that is, et cetera, et cetera. So I found that a little intriguing.
You have a thing called trace context?
Well, that the idea of like okay, a trace has a trace ID, for example,
Yeah.
an ID, some other things. I was a little intrigued by what things people thought were not standardizable.
Yeah.
So we are steadily moving towards more agreement, I think, on some of those fronts.
Huh. Yeah. Well, coming from where I'm sitting, I don't even have span IDs.
Yeah.
But I sort of do. But yeah,
Yeah.
I don't output JSON spans. So
Yeah.
I
I
could,
don't think we'd ever want to require people to output JSON anything. Uh,
okay.
I'm
Oh,
just more intrigued by like if we wanted to be able to like export trace data from some system, in like bulk. If you were to say I want to download
yeah, yeah.
a CSV of trace data,
Yeah,
like what
then
would that look like?
then I could give you some JSON spans for
Yeah.
sure. From
Yeah.
the backend, yes. From the instrumentation, I would be unhappy if I had to support a wire format like this.
No, no, I don't ever want there to be a standardized wire format in
Oh,
that sense. More
I
like an interchange format of like, can we agree that
oh,
this is a valid representation
I
of
see.
data?
Well,
Yeah.
then we'll just all get stuck using Amazon's stuff. That's where they're pushing us, right? The X-ray JSON specification.
Mm, yeah. Well, we don't want that.
No.
Um, also, I have a habit of like when I want to know the answers, I'm perfectly fine to just be wrong on the internet, and I get a lot of good information by posting issues like such as that. I learn a lot, so it was also that on my part.
Cool.
Yeah, um, yeah, it would be interesting to pick that thread up a bit later, but. So we've got Yuri on the call and Baz and um, Manu. I don't think I've met Manu before.
Yes, hi, nice to meet you. I'm a software engineer at Datadog and just want to follow this first meeting for me at least and see what's going on. And so
Oh,
nice
great!
to meet you, all of you.
Nice to meet you, Manu. So you work with Matt Perpick. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, basically we started working on all this open tracing to contribute if it's possible with the community, and also if we reach a good point for Python, we are also interested in moving in supporting OpenTracing in our specific implementation, basically.
Oh, great. Were you discussing that? Have you met Carlos? He works with us on the Python stuff. I think you guys were on a call yesterday about that.
Yeah.
Great. Mm.
Do you know Benjamin?
Oh, yeah, yes. Actually, he can't be here because I think it's quite busy, Benjamin. And but yeah, I probably try to ping him if he can reach us.
Sweet. Yeah. Let's go into the getters. Speaking of Bens, where's my Ben? Okay. Possibly some people are stuck downloading some Zoom software. I always forget that I need to download stuff to make this thing work. Oh, we got Sergey. Good to see you. Ah, and a BHS.
Hello.
Hello.
I thought Yuri wasn't going to be here. Yuri sent me a note saying he was going to be late, but then he kind of seems like he is here.
I'm Ben. I'm just on the phone.
Oh, cool. I'm having a networking issue, so if my connection is bad, I apologize.
Yeah, your networking is interfering with your networking.
Yeah. Let's see. And Pavel said that he had to miss today for some conflict he has on his side. This time zone stuff it's tough. It's rough.
Stupid spherical planet.
Exactly. We should all move to Antarctica. It's melting anyway. So.
Yeah.
Maybe give people let's see if Boss will show up in the next minute or so. Oh, here's Boss. Hi, Boss. All right. Well, that's the quorum. Before we got going, I wanted to welcome Chris to OTSC. Welcome, Chris. I think everyone here, well, most people here know who you are, but do you want to say just like a few sentences about where you came from and so on?
Cool. Yeah, sure. I am Chris Irway. I was a grad student at Brown when I started the first SaaS distributed tracing startup called Tracelitics. It was initially commercializing the X-Trace research from that Rodrigo Fonseca was doing, which some of you have met Jonathan Mace, who's his current graduate student. We were focusing on distributed tracing before people even used the term microservices, which was a weird time to do it. And it's like super exciting that there's so much tracing interest now. And yeah, there's some quirks in the way we do it that are slightly different from the OpenTracing model, but it's very exciting. And so we're kind of very interested in supporting OpenTracing, of course. Yeah, I'm personally an instrumentation author for the Go instrumentation, and I've also been pretty heavily involved in the other languages historically. So yeah, I think we've got a fair amount of experience trying to support like 7 or 8 languages and platforms and across as a kind of APM vendor based on distributed tracing. That was kind of our thing. So going back to them.
Great. Well, welcome. It's great to have you in these calls and
Thanks.
so on. And it'll be awesome to have your experience. I think I've talked with Chris a bit just over the years or whatever, and he has a lot of scar tissue in areas that were just like, babes in the woods. So yeah, it'll be fun to have your have have your opinion shared when we're talking about like Node and like PHP craziness and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah. Like whose instrumented curl multi-get, which is the only asynchronous facility in PHP where you can make several outstanding curl calls
At the same time.
Yeah. Impressive.
I won't hit on PHP. Okay, cool. So I guess we should get started. We actually have kind of a full dance card for this. The first thing I wanted to talk about was meeting time stuff. I decided by virtue of not doing anything about it earlier that I wasn't going to like add all the industrial advisory board people to this time slot. A few of them actually emailed me to talk about conflicts they had. I guess they were just paying attention and noticed what time it was. But a lot of them are in the US, and many of those people are in California. And this is a little bit early, but I also respect that people in Europe need to go home and stuff like that. So I'm not quite sure how to sort it out. I was thinking maybe I would do some kind of use one of those online polling things to figure out when people are available. And I think we'll also be later in the agenda, we have something about the IAB and how we actually want to incorporate them into these meetings, whether that should be every month or whether we just want to have it be on a separate cycle or once a quarter or whatever. And that will probably inform some of this too. I'm personally quite comfortable getting up at this time. In fact, I do anyway, but it would be great to have more of those folks involved. And a lot of them don't get to the office until 9. So 8:30 is just a little bit tight for them. So I guess the real action item here is that I'm going to send out an additional scheduling thing for OTSC people, and I'll probably send one out to OTIAB people separately, and then we can take the data from that and make some sort of informed decision about what works for people in general. So that's that. Any concerns or objections to that? Cool. So I think in the last, Yuri, the OSCON thing was less than a month ago, right? Yuri's muted. I think it was. So we went to Austin for OSCON and did a workshop, tutorial workshop that was 3.5 hours long about tracing in general with sort of a focus on OpenTracing. And it was interesting, the attendance was good. I think it was larger than we'd expected. There were about 80 people who showed up to this thing, and they pretty much stayed for almost all of it. And we had a bunch of materials prepared for them to guide themselves through some tutorial activities in Go and Java, and we probably should have something similar for Python. Yuri wrote up some nice notes about things we'd like to do differently for future ones. But in general, as the most promising thing about it was that it didn't require really expert knowledge. I think certainly anyone on this call could have run it, but also people who were just vaguely familiar probably could have helped people. Most of the questions they were having were just dumb build mechanical things about whether they had the right version of Eclipse installed or something. It wasn't even really difficult stuff. So I think what we would like to do, there's another workshop in Santa Clara Velocity that actually no one from OpenTracing even started. It was this guy at Capital One, Brian Lyles, who has adopted OpenTracing within their organization, who proposed this workshop independent of anyone on this call. And he's actually running it, but I've been in touch with him. I think we're going to try and do a slight rev on things there. And then there's also some workshops later this year in New York, at Velocity New York, that we can try these materials out again and just keep on refining them. But it'd be great to get to a point where we have a bit of a script that we can go through just to get people over the hump of having nothing and then having something that works across a couple of services. Usually once people can get past that point, then they know enough to instrument more of their systems or integrate across more of their systems. So in general, it was a positive experience, although I came away with like a bunch of really obvious things we could improve for next time as well. But I just wanted to share that. I think Yuri is probably getting like out of a car and into a conference room. So yeah, he dropped off, right? Oh, here he is. Yuri, if you're able to talk, do you have anything else you want to add? Okay, I'll take that as a no, I can't talk. We also, a couple of us were at Monitorama just because we were there. It was a interesting thing. We had like a breakfast, bird of a feather kind of thing about tracing. Chris was there, Yuri was there, a few other people were there, and it was good. It was surprising to me actually that there are a bunch of pretty like large enterprise type companies that I would have thought would be fairly late on the adoption curve that had proactively gone to this thing and were already actually using OpenTracing. Like Comcast is basically migrating to OpenTracing. Brian Lyles, as I mentioned earlier, is doing this. And there was also some like vendor support that I wasn't really previously clued into like their exact plans, but people from New Relic showed up, and this guy Victor, who is a PM for some of their like agent stuff, he seems pretty enthusiastic about the idea of OpenTracing support, you know, by Q4 and Q3, something like that. So there was just like a lot of pretty organic support for this standard throughout, you know, like large enterprises that, again, I think of as being a bit slow in general, as well as like these sort of more established public company vendors. So that was good. Chris, do you have any comments since you were there?
Yeah, I mean, like Brian's talk, he was like, so Capital One, enterprise monitoring, but here's the things you got to be doing: logging, metrics, tracing. And that kind of just that triumvirate of concerns just kept coming up as the conventional wisdom, I would say, several times a day in the Monitorama talks, maybe a couple times a day. But, you know, and it just got a lot of shout outs as something you should be thinking about, which is different from previous years, I'd say.
Yeah, I did feel like it was a bit of some sort of inflection point or something like that. I don't know how else to describe it, but yeah, I just wanted to mention that. So for this, moving forward in this agenda, trying to get through to the technical stuff, leave time for that. The OpenTracing Industrial Advisory Board. So a bunch of people have been invited to participate, and they accepted and so on. As I said earlier, I didn't actually put them on this meeting invite because I wanted to discuss like how we think it would be most beneficial to incorporate them. I've been talking a lot just to keep this meeting flowing, but if I'm going to pause and see what other people think. I wrote a couple of straw man type ideas in this doc, but I'm curious what people think would be most useful. I have to start calling on people. It's terrible.
Yeah, sorry, we're useless.
Okay, I'll make it a little bit easier. So I would posit that like if we just invite people to show up at the meeting, many of them will show up, and that'll be fun. It'll be nice to have them there. I would rather that we had like a cadence where I'm not talking about like a presentation of slides or something like that, but people would share like 5 to 10 minutes of information about tracing within the organizations. Like I met last week with this guy, Jonathan Caldwell, who's at Facebook and is running a bunch of their tracing stuff. And it was just a really interesting thing to hear him talk about it. And for what it's worth, it's not about open tracing, right? It's just like they're trying to play tracing at Facebook. It's actually pretty challenging because Facebook is a bottom-up culture and there's a lot of heterogeneity in the way that things have been built there. And so it's just interesting to hear him talk about it. And like, I would love it if there's just a cadence where the people on this call like heard those sorts of stories from time to time. So we could like carve out, you know, a piece of this meeting every month where someone presents something along those lines. Again, like a very informal kind of Q&A type of thing, not like a a deck, you know. An alternative would be to have once a quarter we could have like a more formal thing where there's, you know, where we make an effort to have a larger audience and get a lot of people into this call and have people present things in a more concerted way. There's like a range of formality. Those are the sorts of things I've been thinking about.
Cool. And then there's a process for submitting like items to this the meeting backlog or what have you.
Yeah, and I mean this document is I think globally editable that we're using as an agenda, and I would like until it breaks, the simplest thing would be just to have always have the next meeting date on there and just have people just add stuff until that's not working.
Oh, I didn't. Okay, let me find that doc. Thanks.
I like an informal idea, especially because it'll be easier for people to contribute in small bits than like plan a big hourly talk or something like that. Maybe with a few points we could give them to maybe structure it. Like I'm always curious, like what's not working, what's broken, what do they wish they had, things like that.
Yeah.
Do you have a blend of people who are like writing their own tracing systems like Facebook, or people who just want to use it, or what's the sort of split?
I would have to like literally look down the list. It's definitely a mix. It's a combination of people who like, yeah, there's definitely, you know, people like Facebook. There are people who are like definitely not, in fact, there's intentionally not writing their own tracing system and are just thinking about this as an instrumentation problem for their organizations. I think that if there aren't, there should be people who care about things that like the service mesh layer, which has like a role in tracing, but you're neither like a vendor nor a direct consumer of tracing, but more like a participant in it and stuff like that. So, yeah. Cool. All right, well, in lieu of other suggestions, I'm going to propose that we find a time for this meeting that works for, you know, the IAB people as well as the OTSC people, and then try and schedule into the agenda like a 10-minute thing towards the beginning where you know, we'll rotate through and just have people say a few words about something interesting relating to tracing in their sphere, whatever that happens to be. And, you know, depending on their role, that will mean different things. But I think that could be pretty useful. And I like Matt's suggestion a lot of this is not, in fact, specifically, it's a non-goal to share like great success stories about how everything works, but like to be a little bit more focused on things that like are not impossible, but just aren't working quite as well as we'd like, which is to say where there's like an actual opportunity in the area for improvement. We'll try and focus on that kind of thing because I think those are the purpose of this should be to get information into this group, to get people thinking about changes we should be making to like improve this experience for people. So I like that idea.
It'll also be nice just for the first meeting to kind of just get to know everyone, you know, and just see where people are at. So I don't know if the first one needs to necessarily be super structured.
Yeah. Cool. So I was curious, I'm going to move forward here. So this ActiveSpan thing got merged, you know, I don't know, about a month ago or something in Java. And this, for just to be clear for people, is like OpenTracing support for like a somewhat pluggable thread local style span propagation, and also some changes to the API to allow for a propagation of like the active span context from thread to thread or executor to executor. And we merged that in after making sure that it worked in you know, a couple of systems. And then a few people have actually been like upgrading instrumentation to take advantage of this. I asked Pavel to, like, since he wasn't able to join today, to write down some notes which we added to the document for this call. I know that some people are not in the document, so I'll just kind of summarize what he said. He's upgraded sort of the Java Web Servlet filter, JAX-RS, Spring, REST templates, OKHTTP, OpenFeign, Apache, all that stuff. And they're all upgraded to use ActiveSpan. He observed that the ref counting stuff actually simplified some of the integrations, for instance, in Spring, where previously there was some kind of like manual ref counting happening at the instrumentation layer in order to know when it was safe to finish something, and that is no longer an issue. And then he included some links in this doc, which I won't like follow verbally, where there's something like interesting that happened. And he linked to having some difficulty debugging some of this stuff, like when activations and deactivations, basically when there's an extra reference, it was difficult to figure out where it came from. And I don't know, we should probably think about ways to make it easier to debug that stuff. I actually remember this happening a lot with Dapper as well, and that it's just like, it's like a classically hard thing to debug, and it can be made a lot easier with some utilities that can be opted in to, like if you're trying to debug something. So those are most of his thoughts, but in general, I think the Gestalt thing was pretty good, and it seemed like it was making things better, not worse, and certainly improves things down the stack when that you don't need to pass the span around. So that was his experience. Are there other people on this call who have, like, Per Matt's point, who've had issues with it where it's either not worked, caused problems, or just been too confusing, or some combination?
I know Sergey hit a bump, but I think it was more just being surprised that you don't call finish anymore, but you call deactivate. So there's a certain amount of maybe just getting information out there.
Yeah. It's about that I cannot deactivate span in another thread. So in one thread I finish span, but I have this span active in another thread, and I cannot deactivate it in another thread.
Yeah.
Yes. Some kind of finish thread is not deactivated. Yeah, that's the thing.
Yeah, I think in the case that Sergey was referring to, what happened is that there was some work that was, happening asynchronously, and then there was kind of a finish callback that, not from an OpenTracing standpoint, but just for the work that was being done. And when that callback was executed, the API we have now forces you to do this kind of awkward thing where you take this continuation and then you activate it and deactivate it all in one line, and which is this weird way of saying basically, okay, I'm done. We could certainly add some kind of syntactic thing that would make that more elegant and less kind of verbose, I guess. I'm not, but the mechanics of it are actually kind of working as intended, in the sense that there was this active reference until this callback was invoked, and once it was invoked, we do need to like decrement that reference, and this is the only way to do it in the current API.
I think I've referred to that combo as flush span before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Moving on, we had a call, I guess, Scott, this week has been just completely insane. I think it was Wednesday that Matt at Datadog organized, and Emmanuel and a few other folks in Datadog were at, as well as myself and a few other people, about ActiveSpan in Python, or some equivalent to ActiveSpan in Python. I don't know, Matt, I'm sick of talking. Do you want to summarize sort of how that went?
Yeah, sure. I'll explain it. So basically, I think this is the main blocker for us getting like going whole hog on OpenTracing. So we wanted to like lock it down first and then start converting our integrations and customers and all that kind of crap. I think that So I think the summary is, so I think at the end of the day, it was good because I think everybody who knows, the people who care about it now know who each other are and can start talking about it. I don't think there was any sort of technical consensus. And I said I would send out notes, but I didn't. I think the general gist of it is to make a slightly clear summary, as Yuri suggested, of the goals, like what exactly is this going to support. B, making a small set of examples of real world cases that we actually want to support with no tracing involved, just like what are the patterns in code that we would see across Gevent, async IO, etc. And then figuring out how that will wrap into it. I think in Datadog's current tracing system, we have something that is, I would say, less flexible and potentially might handle less cases or fewer cases. I don't know which one it is. But mostly works and people can use it and write code with no problems. Or no problems that we've seen yet. We have not had anybody run up against the wall. So, but I'm also a firm believer that like you want your lowest level API to be maximally flexible, and then hopefully we can just have nice, clean things for people to use on top. So I guess for going forward from here, if there's anybody that like really cares about this and wants to be in the loop, let me know and I'll make sure that happens. I'm sort of setting an internal goal to like try to have as much consensus as possible so we could have like a PR on the repository, hopefully by the end of next week, and get her going. So that's basically that. So if anybody cares, you can write me or whatever, and we'll make sure everybody's looped in. I wanted to like make sure that our ducks were in a row a little bit before just getting into like a 1,000 line GitHub comment impossible to follow debate. So hopefully we can present like a very tight set of examples, how it will work, whatever. So the other thing that would be nice is if anybody has examples of things that were difficult or patterns that were difficult in Java or mandatory in Java with the active span stuff, I'd definitely like to see them because there may be some that are relevant for this. So those would be my like two sort of questions for the group. You don't have to send them now, but today would be great.
Great. Yeah, thanks a lot. That's, I think, a really excellent summary of what took place on Wednesday, and I agree with your like all of your assessments of things too. I would maybe add one sort of small detail, which is that there is an existing. It's linked in the meeting notes for this, but there is sort of like the thing I liked a lot about the work that Emmanuel done was that it shows how the stuff is like there are these three layers. There's the layer of actual like user level instrumentation, which we want, of course, to be really concise and clear. Then there's the layer of the core OpenTracing Python stuff, and then there's sort of this layer in between of like connecting the core OpenTracing stuff into things like Tornado and Gevent and stuff like that. And those three pieces, it's helpful, I think, as we're going through this discussion to try and like be a little tiny bit disciplined when we get into the code about knowing which layer we're talking about. Is that I know that for myself, I care deeply about that like application level instrumentation stuff. That needs to be really clean and easy. And I also care deeply about the OpenTracing Python stuff because that needs to be really minimal and like just tight, and I could give a shit about the rest of it. Like if it works, I don't care. It's like, so it's just like I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't mind if there's a lot of subtlety in that middle layer as long as it works and is performant. But it disturbs me a lot, and I'm sure everyone would agree if there's like tons of really subtle stuff at the application layer. And also it seems like a total red flag if like the OpenTracing API just like turns into this like 5,000 line thing, right? So anyway, that I just wanted to like add that as like another kind of nice to have thing as we're going through this discussion. But I'm really excited.
Yep, totally agree with both of those. So yeah, Manu's in New York next week, so I think this will be it'll make it a lot easier to crank this out, and we'll crank on it a lot.
Yuri, not to volunteer you, I mean, I know that you're insanely busy. Are you, like, do you have any cycles next week, given that you also live there? You're muted, or you're not audible anyway. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Oh, well.
And Matt, I've been working with a guy named Carlos Alberto, who I think you met on that call.
Yeah, I'll definitely keep him in the loop because it sounds like he's actually doing the stuff, so that's important.
Yeah, he's happy to do actual work on this with you guys.
Yeah.
We were already working on it, so
okay, cool.
Yeah, feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Yeah, Yuri, I didn't see your response, but I'll email you, and if you want to meet up, whatever, we'll figure it out.
Okay, cool. Okay, so moving on, I'm actually going to change the order of this. I think some of the stuff is easier than, let's do the easier stuff first. So there's this proposal, it's formally issue 72, an OpenTracing specification repository from Felix Barney, who has been doing a lot of work on this thing called Stage Monitor. And he was proposed, so I'll put a link to the thing in the chat for this. He was proposing this idea of a tag for spans called type. And an example of a type in his scheme would be something like a full page load. To me, it seemed like he was like getting at things where there was like a semantic meaning to like what this type of span was, and a sense that there could be like an apples to apples relationship between all spans that shared a type, even if they had different operation names and so on and so forth. I hope that's like a reasonable paraphrasing of this issue. It's a lot of words, and I didn't write it. So we already have like a notion of a quote unquote component, which is sort of different. Like that was intended to be the classic example would be like gRPC. Like if gRPC is generating the spans, then the component should be set to gRPC, but there's no implication that all gRPC spans should necessarily even be the same type of thing. So I'm just curious, like this seemed like a pretty interesting proposal to me, and there were a bunch of thoughts about it that were on GitHub, but I thought it'd be worth like raising it here. It seems like a really valuable thing to have if we can figure out what to call it and how to specify it. But when I got down to the details, to brass tacks, I was kind of tying myself up in knots thinking about how to make this work.
For me, my one question about it is it seems like, kind, type, things of that nature, it is very vague and nebulous. And if it's userland code, I don't really see how we need to agree on these things, provided you can, index based off of tags. However, if it's going to be things library developers are going to be doing, that's an area where we need to have some agreement. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that to me is, if we're going to invent a new thing and have it be useful, it seems like it would only be useful in that context. So maybe that helps scope it down a bit as to what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I basically 100% agree with that. Just to sort of like restate it, I think it's 100% about being able to trace things and know when you're tracing the same kind of a thing and collect statistics about it. I think this is a pretty big barrier for OpenTracing contrib libraries to be reusable across backends. Just thinking about like SQL tracing, like you care about which database, SQL isn't the best one because in general you're only tracing one thing and you don't need separate types of SQL queries. But in anything where you're tracing like multiple CPU operations in the same component that we have now, then I think we need something. So I'm pretty passionately but like, I don't necessarily think we need a new thing, but I do believe there's like a documentation thing where like, if you want to write a really great usable OpenTracing library, it sort of has to follow this sort of convention. It may just be a convention and documentation thing with component, but I think something is needed.
Yeah, over here we've typically used duck typing. Like if it has db.query or db.host or something, we know it's a database query. I think that was Pavel's comment in the Gitter or something in the PR. But yeah, totally agreed that if you need to differentiate inside of a component or that you'd get into trouble. But if we needed to just find all your queries, ideally you're using the other tags related to database queries to tell us that that's what the span is. But yeah, I mean, I would love to see a list of proposed types, basically. What are the, you go kind of crazy.
Yeah, I think it is vastly most relevant at service boundary levels where you have like lots of types of queries coming in, and agree that those can be served by things like DB query or whatever sort of type or at that level component is probably enough. And for gRPC, component probably is enough, but I think that there are I don't know. My feeling is that there's like other places and it's nice to sort of offer that.
Yeah, I mean, but like taking gRPC as an example. So right now, if you were to follow the letter of the law, like the component name for gRPC would be gRPC, okay? But then let's say that you're an organization that uses gRPC and Thrift, which there are many, and you wanted to just like set up something to monitor RPC performance in general. Right now, you'd be doing that by basically ordering together gRPC and Thrift. I mean, we actually now have a Thrift OpenTracing thing, which is sort of exciting, I guess, although P.S. I hate Thrift, but it would be nice if you could just be like anything that has this magic tag that says this is an RPC. Of course, we have things that are like this with these like kind tags and stuff, pair the duck typing comment, but this is just sort of like a thought example, I guess, a thought experiment. It would be nice if there was a way to isolate all of that data with semantically without having to like create some sort of OR expression of things that happen to like, match the semantics. I will say though, I actually tried to do something like this once in my career at Google. We were designing like this sort of like fleet-wide monitoring thing, and it seemed like a good idea at the time, but it was incredibly difficult actually. Like there are different, even something as simple as like, what was the thing that was like really kind of confounding? Like the idea of like defining like network locality was like really relative to Google, and we were trying to have like a set of tags basically to define like whether you were like local or not. But some people that meant the same rack, other people meant the same like this big switch. Like some people meant the same region. It's actually really hard. This is of course slightly different than what we're dealing with here, but I found it really hard to come up with semantic definitions that didn't break down when you really like actually tried to use them for something. You ended up like bringing in a bunch of stuff that wasn't all actually apples to apples in the end. And so the statistics you got out weren't really that meaningful. So that's like my
yeah. So just to like be 100% clear, the use case that like I see at Datadog is like, and so just to be 100% clear, I think this is a feature that has two potential uses. One is that OpenTracing libraries can be reusable across OpenTracing backends and support the reasonable set of features that you might expect from this system, or a system that does this kind of a thing. I know there's always going to be differences, but in general, it's going to be different. And B, also giving users the way, when they're tracing lots of different things, to have a very clear way of linking it. I'm slightly wary of like ending up to be like, oh, I'm checking if this is a DB query or this other tag or something, giving people a clear way of saying this is this and I'm measuring this explicitly. For me, this boils down to wanting to be able to show things like, I think like by default, any tracing system is probably going to show you like your 10 slowest endpoints across your web service, or some statistics across what queries are being sent and how slow they are and all those kind of things. I think it's very nice to be, and I think that mostly is handleable now in OpenTracing with no changes, because those are all service boundary level things. I think it's pretty nice to be able to offer the same functionality for internal methods. CPU methods and whatever your application is. Like, I don't know if it's like process the video, or at Datadog, it might be like merge a bunch of different time series together. Critical operations that you run all the time that have some sort of different characteristics about them that you want to group and whatever, and giving people a clear way to do that. That's like my exact use case here, where I think there's like something that isn't supported, basically.
And that's not just a type, that's also a name, right? There's no field for that CPU method's name in the current tags spec.
Well, I think that is technically, so, I mean, yeah, we have a notion of like a name,
Sure.
I don't want to go down the rabbit hole here. So just literally shut me down at any moment. I'm not proposing that we take our nomenclature, because I think ours is a little bit hard to understand, even for like Datadog employees who like added their own tracing to our own stuff. And if we had another cut at it, I might do it a little differently. But what we have is sort of like the name of the operation, and then the sort of like primary first dimension. We called it like name and resource. Name would be like rails.request or template.render or encode the image.encode or something like that. And then the resource being the sort of prime dimension that you're sort of like measuring along, which I think most closely is OpenTracing, which would be like the SQL query, the route of the URL, those type of things.
Yeah, when I was adapting our stuff to OpenTracing, I thought it was weird that the only place to put the service name is in the client side, where it says peer.service. Like, that's the only service name tag is.
That's interesting. I think the idea was that the service is often global to the tracer, and most implementations I'm aware of will, at tracer construction time, will take a service name for that local service. And that's why it's not something that's reflected on every span, because that's shared across the entire tracer. It's kind of funny that it's not part of the spec. It's just sort of like this assumption that like most implementers will choose to do something like that. I just wanted to clarify that's
Right.
the expectation. It probably just be written down somewhere.
Right.
I think that one works because it's something you set in one place, and it's like
Yeah.
you can get away from it. I think it's
But
a
then-
little difficult on like the internal.
Yeah. And then, similar to your research stuff, we get the controller in action for Rails, whatever MVC stuff. And that doesn't really have a home here either. Like the idea of the transaction or resource being called, as well as the function called profiling. Like if you're annotating or decorating a method to trace a specific CPU heavy function, there doesn't seem to be like a sub component or a segment name for the function the CPU heavy function you're trying to profile.
So just to add another little point of data, I think from my travels around the OpenTracing Uber code, I could be wrong. Yuri, I think you're doing this sort of implicitly in your stuff by doing like Redis : get 123 in your thing. So it seems that you sort of have like the name of what you're tracing before the colon and the after. Am I right, or am I totally making this up?
That just happened this way. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's just like one of the naming scheme that particular instrumentation picked. It's not always the case, but I mean, I can easily see that being operation name get and component Redis. So it doesn't have to be all in the name.
Agreed, because that's a service boundary thing. Yeah. For me,
yeah, your examples previously, like encode image, I also don't understand why you can't just flip it around and make operation name being whatever you call the resource, and then component being image encode.
That would actually work for me. I think that it's just a bit of a documentation tweak.
The way I've been thinking about this, I'm not like just to throw another hat in the ring, is that the operation name definitely should be like logically static. Like it shouldn't be data dependent, or you end up with like cardinality stuff. And that I think it makes sense for the operation name itself to be something that you as a consumer, as like a end user of a monitoring system, would care about the distribution of latency for that operation name. Like, and that's the thing that you want to reduce dimensionally, probably by doing something with tags. That, like, to me seems to be, like you want that operation name to be the big distribution, the big multimodal distribution, and you use things like tags to like find the modes of that distribution and to like explain the variance. And like that's the way I'm trying to orient my thinking around this, which I think would probably suggest that you'd want the operation name to be kind of what Matt was suggesting, where it would be, I can't remember exactly what it was, but this, you know, image thing, and then the dimensions would allow you to like drill down on it. I think it's problematic to use things like the route as a tag for that type of stuff, because the route has a bunch of unique IDs in it, like it's not going to be statistically interesting. So ideally you find something that's like a little bit like halfway between like these unique URLs and this like giant morass of just static, you know, operation name stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's well said.
Going back to the actual issue here, I mean, I think this is actually pretty interesting, and I'm making notes here that we should like probably do a better job of describing better documentation about operation name choices. There's something already in the spec, but I think it could be a little more detailed, and this is pretty essential. But the actual issue is about this idea of a type tag. I don't think that we really came to like a strong place of alignment, frankly, in this discussion around what we should do about this.
Yeah. It's not even clear to me that people, maybe I'm putting fuel on the fire here, but it wasn't 100% clear to me that people were debating the same thing either. I
think that's a fair assessment. Maybe what I'll do is go back to that issue and try and make sure that what I'd like to actually kind of pair the point about the Python stuff and like having use cases written out. I think it would be helpful for that to be like, what are we actually trying to accomplish, not in the instrumentation, but in terms of eventual use cases for this type of data, and make sure that we're clear about that. It seems sort of fruitless to try and like add something. Like I would say just off the cuff, I don't like the idea of a tag name called type. I think it's like way too general. But if we can figure out what this thing actually is and like what use case it's going to serve, that would be like a huge step forward in terms of it being like a viable proposal. Does that seem like a reasonable path? Okay. Make this issue about actual product. All right, we only have like 12 minutes, and I want to at least get through the next one of these two. So there's an issue number 24. Oh, go ahead.
Before we go on, does it want to land on somebody's plate to like push that discussion forward a little bit?
I signed it to myself, but I'm happy to, that was like a, what's the word, a martyrdom thing. I'm definitely not feeling any desire to do that. I just think someone needs to move it forward. So I'll try my best. I've had a very, Ted, who actually works in my office, can attest to how insane my schedule has been the last couple of weeks, but I think maybe it's going to, I started like blocking time when no one can schedule meetings, so I should be able to actually do stuff from time to time again, and that this will be on that list. So there's an issue 24, which I pasted in the chat here, around a correlation ID type of thing. I actually don't really want to discuss that issue exactly, but it more reminded me of another thing that's happening, which is the proliferation of these like service mesh things, Linkerd and Envoy probably being the best known. I think HA proxy in a way is sort of like yesteryear's version of this, but it wasn't really that thoroughly thought out. And then there's Istio that was recently announced by Google, which also like in some way like falls into this general category. And they present a bit of a conundrum, I think, for tracing in general, in that like on the one hand, it's really exciting because you have this thing that attaches to every process in your system, which is like an ideal place to integrate stuff like tracing. Okay, that's great. But it's like this black box piece of software that you could, but you don't, I think you don't want to force people to recompile or even distribute like binary objects in it, like, pluggable type libraries necessarily with this thing, which makes it difficult to make it, you know, vendor neutral. And there's two areas of standardization that could help here. One would be standardizing headers, which has been this like hilariously difficult thing for years. I don't see it getting any easier. And unlike the OpenTracing API, where that was like, there was kind of a vacuum there, this is an area where there are many competing standards already. There's like de facto standards from Zipkin. There's this trace context proposal from Google. Microsoft is like trying to do an RFC with like, you know, the internet people around their own thing. They're all like, oh yeah, Amazon has like the X-ray spec for this. They're all like kind of the same thing, but actually not compatible. So introducing like a fifth standard does not sit well with me, frankly. But I don't like any of the ones that are being proposed either. So it's like, there's that level of standardization. And then there's also the level of standardization of getting like the type of data that you get from things like Linkerd and Envoy is actually very simple. It's just like timing data with some tags and like that's it. Like it's really, really simple. And getting it out of the process in a way that was somewhat standard would also make it much easier for tracing systems to integrate with these things, and much easier for people who run these types of service meshes to integrate with, you know, Zipkin or Jaeger or Datadog or whatever. So, I mean, I think that would be a really beneficial area for OpenTracing to like have a more concerted opinion, although it is like a little bit outside of, well, not a little bit, it's definitely outside of the kind of like initial starting point for OpenTracing around API. So I wanted to get people's thoughts about this, like not what should we do specifically, but like whether we should even pursue something in this direction, or if that's too much of a scope creep for OpenTracing.
I have some thoughts, you don't mind? As far as the headers go, I think the reason why there's difficulty picking a solution there is they seem to be too narrowly focused. And I think where OpenTracing could help and not just add yet another standard a la XKCD would be to just pick the header names and not just say that the values are, you know, opaque as far as we're concerned. But there are a couple key header names that without them, it's hard to tell firewalls and things of that nature what they should whitelist. And I think there's some benefit to just doing an incremental approach there of saying like there is a trace context, there is, you know, a span ID or something of that nature. There is like a standard header to put your baggage in, maybe some extra ones for baggage overflow. There are some standard concepts for OpenTracing, and just having a standard place to put those regardless of how you're implementing them, I think would be helpful. And would also potentially be compatible with these other formats. If you can convince them just to use these header names, then trace context can put trace context style values into those things, and other people can put other things. So I don't know if that's so incremental it's not helpful, but I've definitely wanted to have at least that for the headers and the in-band stuff. And then for the out-of-band stuff, I've been interested in something like an exchange format, which is essentially evolving into a logging format. But again, the nuance there is I don't think it's useful to say everyone literally has to use this like JSON log format or something like that. It's more about saying this is the information you need to have written down in a more data-oriented way rather than an English-oriented way. So that you can look at the log information you're pumping out of your system and be able to see what in there maps to what you would need to suck in. And it would be pretty easy to create tooling that could just map from various standard syslog formats and whatnot that things are pumping out, you know, into, you know, something that a tracing system can ingest. So just identifying the keys and value types that you would need. So I don't know if that's too incremental, but for me, that would be a nice middle ground. It didn't over-prescribe or prevent any kind of future, you know, development or innovation. Because it's really hard to go to people and say, oh, if you want to use OpenTracing, like change your log format to this thing, right? It's easier to say we can extract, provided in your format, you've got, like this kind of data in there.
End game here is to be able to tie some log lines to the request that created it.
Yes, exactly.
I don't
like if you're at a proxy layer like hot proxy and you would like to ingest, hot proxy logs and then have those show up in your traces later, right? But you want to do that through log ingestion rather than directly instrumenting hot proxy. That's a classic example of this.
There's a couple of like troublesome things about this though. Like first of all, at least for some installations I'm aware of personally, writing that data to disk would actually be like kind of like a showstopper. So I don't think I don't mean to like get into like the weeds of engineering issues, but unfortunately it's relevant that like if we're talking about logs as in logs on disk, that could be really problematic. The amount of IO you do just to like write those down and read them back, if it's just a queue ultimately is like potentially prohibitive. So I don't know, I kind of want to mention that. I know we're not resolve this. Before we get into the details of what we would do, I wanted to the first thing I wanted to figure out is whether people thought this entire topic is just like out of scope. That's the thing I wanted to like first assess. Are there, maybe a better way to say it is, are there people who think it would be better if like OpenTracing just like stayed out of all this wire format stuff entirely? Because it will certainly consume time and energy to go into it.
I would personally like to solve them, I think. But yeah, I don't know how we will do it about being the fifth standard, but definitely. And the out of band seems even easier to solve. The problem that I actually have with the service mesh there is different slightly. It's like one of them is that they essentially pretend that they provide tracing for free to all the services, but they only do that when there is an in-process propagation and they don't say much about it. They say, oh, by the way, you just need to forward the headers. And so that's one issue. And then obviously there is no way of instrumenting your application internally in that case with like more stuff. And the second problem is, the sampling problem. So I don't know how, like if the Envoy or whatever, if they don't kind of include custom libraries from the tracing system and they do something standard, then it means that we kind of have to standardize on what the sampling decisions they're making apparently. So that's the big difficulty for me to see in that model.
That makes sense. And I sort of agree with your critique that it's like, oh, and by the way, you have to forward headers, which is actually, that was the hard problem originally. Like that was the thing that was like hardest, is harder than the application boundaries necessarily. But I still think I've seen it work, and it's a really nice thing if you're using one of those like Linkerd Envoy type things to get that data just in one fell swoop is like a pretty beautiful, it's a pretty beautiful integration in terms of the amount of and so I would love there to be like a clearer story, and the handoff between those things and like an OpenTracing compatible tracer. It's not going to be like a clean, flexible, portable thing unless we have a little bit more specification. Given that we're pretty much out of time, I think we're not going to be able to talk about Chris Irway's parent-of proposal on this call, although I promise that I think it's interesting. You should all check it out. It's in the meeting notes. And it kind of is like, if you think about OpenTracing being more of like a dapperish thing, this is like something that's pretty important and actually missing if you're doing the kind of Xtrace style thing. And it's also, parent-of would be really helpful if you're trying to do principled clock skew correction. So I just want to do a little advertisement for some of its benefits. So take a look at that, I guess. And then I will send out some scheduling stuff to figure out what times will work for everyone on this call, and also some of the OTI AAB people, and try to get some industrial folks outside of this call to like agree to talk for maybe 10 minutes next time. And if other people have feedback about the agenda of this call or the way it's being run or whatever, please just send that to me directly, and I'm happy to take it. Yuri, I believe this has been recorded, right? So I'll post the. So, yeah. Cool. It does have this little pulsing red light, so that suggests some sort of permanence. But yeah, let's share a link to this video once it's available, and and go from there. But thanks everyone for joining. I want to be tight on the schedule, so we'll stop at this point. But I hope you all have a great weekend.
Thanks, guys. Cheers.
Bye.
Yeah.
Peace, y'all. Take care.
Thank you.